Welcome to the workshop. We are here to show you our recent version of the Piranha CNC machine. We have made some modifications of the kit, and in order for the kit to follow the video and vice versa, we have found that it was necessary to update the video as well. So today Rasmus, he will show you how we assemble the machine and also all the details in how to put together and make a nice functional machine like the one we have here in front of me.
We are starting on page 1, and the first thing we'll do is to put the screws and the T-nuts onto our linear guides. So what I like to do is put the linear guides on the edge of the table like this, and then take some screws and some T-nuts, and then I'll simply go like this. And I'm just making sure that the screws only catch the first thread on the T-nut. That will make it easier for us to slide it onto the C-beams later. So, now we put all of our screws in our linear guides and we are ready to move on. Now I'm going to take my C-beam and the linear guides, and then I'm going to slide the linear guide onto the C-beam like this. So I'm going to use my fingers here to align all of the T-nuts going into the track in the V-slot profile. I'll do the same for the long profiles. Now that I've put all of the profiles onto the C-beam, I'm just going to tighten one screw in each end of each profile. And that's just to ensure that they don't stick out in either end. So I'll just feel that it sits centered here. Now we are going to use the alignment tool to align the linear guide against the C-beam. So I'll start by taking my tool, sliding it onto the side of the C-beam like this. Then I'll tighten it. Then I'll tighten the first screw on my linear guide. Now I can loosen this screw that I tightened earlier. Now I can move the alignment tool. For the Z-axis profile and the X-axis profile, where we have two linear guides, I will leave one unadjusted such that the carriage can align it later. So now I'll take my tool and move on to the X-axis. And again I'll slide it in here. I'll tighten the first screw and then loosen the other screw in the other end. When doing the longer pieces like this, I'll start out by having the alignment tool against the first screw and the second screw. Then I'll skip one screw and go to the fourth screw. And then I can skip two screws, and then I'll keep skipping two screws. I'm gonna skip 2 screws. Just like I did on the Z-axis, I'll leave the other rail unaligned such that the carriage can align it later. Now I'm doing one of the Y-axis profiles, and I can see that this is the screw I tightened to align the linear guide in this direction. So I'll just tighten it up in the other end, and then I can loosen it over here. So now we are ready to slide the linear guide blocks onto the linear guides. So I'll take my linear guide block, and be careful to keep the plastic piece inside of it when it's not on the rail. And when putting it on, the rail will replace the plastic piece. And when putting these on, all of the nibbles should point away from each other. So you can see that they're pointing outwards. Starting on page 2 now, and I'll start by taking my L brackets, and I'm going to put the screws and the T-nuts on them. And I'm simply doing this because it's easier than doing it in the profile. So I'll take my screws, just like I did with the linear guide, so I'll just make it catch one thread. And I'm going to do this for all of the L brackets. So now we are ready to assemble the frame. So I'm going to start off by laying my Y-axis C-beams on the table. And I like to do this step upside down. You can also do it the other way. I put them like this. And then I'm going to take my L brackets. And on the L bracket, one of the screws will be closer to the corner than the other screw. In this case, we'll take the screw with the longer distance to the corner. And that screw will go against the C-beam. Now I'll take my cross beams and slide them onto the L bracket like this. Now that I've put these on, I'll just slide them to their approximate position. So now that I've put them in their approximate position, I'll just tighten up one screw so they don't move around as much. At this point I'll prepare my end plates with screws and T-nuts. So just like we did previously, I'll insert the screw and just make it catch the T-nut with one thread. Now I'm going to put my end plates onto the C-beams, and when deciding which one to put where, I just have to keep in mind that when putting this on, I also have to have a 2040 profile sitting here in the same way that this sits here. And I'll tighten these up, but I'll just make sure that it sits flat against the edge of the, or the back side of the C-beam here. And now I'll do the rest of the end plates. Now that we've put on all of the end plates, we're ready to put on the front and the back profiles like this. I'll just slide it onto the C-nuts. Now I'm going to flip the frame, and to do that I'll just tighten up one screw in each end of the 2040 profiles, just to make sure they don't go anywhere. Now that we've flipped the assembly, I'll just make sure to loosen up all the connections in either end or either side of the machine. So in this case I'll just loosen them up on this side. So I'll make sure all of these connections are loose, because we need to align the distance between the y-axis with the gantry, which will be done in the next step. So now it should be possible to move this y-axis C-beam back and forth on the cross profiles. Now we're moving on to page 3. Now I'll start by doing the anti-backlash knot. So here I'll thread in the grub screw. And then I'll just insert my ACME rod into the anti-backlash knot. And then I'll tighten this until I feel the amount of resistance that I want. Now I'll lock it with the nut here. Now I'm ready to put the blocks onto the plates here. now we've put on all of the ACME blocks on our plates, and we'll just let them sit loosely so we can adjust them later when we put in the screws. So now we are starting on page 4, and we are ready to put on the side plates onto our Y-axis linear guide blocks. I will insert all of these screws loosely and then tighten them up. Now I'm doing the other side. Now we're ready to put the X-axis beam in between the two plates. So now I'm ready to mount the X-axis beam. And what I'll do is put one of these boxes in here, and then I'll put my X-axis on top of it. And now I can see that the distance between the plates is too small, so I have to pull out this Y-axis a little bit. Now I can move this plate into position, and I'll insert one screw here. And then I'll do one screw in the other side. I'll just loosely insert all of the screws. So now we're ready to move the gantry back and forth, just to align everything. Now we can start tightening up the X-axis beam to the plates. Now, because this Y-axis beam is still loosely attached to the cross beams, it can now move into the position it wants to be in. So now we are getting ready to tighten up the frame, and what I'll start by doing is to tighten up the front and the back profile. And to do this, I'll just ensure that they can move freely back and forth. So now I can move this profile to the right and to the left. Now I have to move the gantry all the way to the front here. And then I'll just let everything rest in the position it wants to be in. And then I'll tighten up these screws. And I'll do the same thing over here. I'll center the profile and tighten it up. Now we're ready to do the cross beams in the middle of the machine. What I'll start by doing is to loosen up all of the connections so that I can move them freely. And we already did that in this side of the machine. Now I'll just adjust the distance between these two profiles in the distance that I want. So I'll start out by adjusting the distance between the two profiles here. Then I'll just fasten the L bracket against the C-beam. Now I'll move my gantry above the profile. I can now center the profile. Now I'll tighten the rest of the screws, and when doing this I have to put it upwards against the bottom side of the C-beam. So now the frame should be fully assembled and we are ready to move on. So now we are starting on page 4 and we are ready to put on the side plates onto our Y-axis linear guide blocks. I will insert all of these screws loosely and then tighten them up. Now I'm doing the other side. Now we're ready to put the X-axis beam in between the two plates. So now I'm ready to mount the X-axis beam. And what I'll do is put one of these boxes in here, and then I'll put my X-axis on top of it. And now I can see that the distance between the plates is too small, so I have to pull out this Y-axis a little bit. Now I can move this plate into position, and I'll insert one screw here. And then I'll do one screw in the other side. I'll just loosely insert all of the screws. So now we're ready to move the gantry back and forth, just to align everything. And now we can start tightening up the X-axis beam to the plates. Now, because this Y-axis beam is still loosely attached to the cross beams, it can now move into the position it wants to be in. So now we are getting ready to tighten up the frame, and what I'll start by doing is to tighten up the front and the back profile. And to do this, I'll just ensure that they can move freely back and forth. So now I can move this profile to the right and to the left. Now I have to move the gantry all the way to the front here. And then I'll just let everything rest in the position it wants to be in. And then I'll tighten up these screws. And I'll do the same thing over here. I'll center the profile and tighten it up. Now we're ready to do the cross beams in the middle of the machine. What I'll start by doing is to loosen up all of the connections so that I can move them freely. And we already did that in this side of the machine. now I'll just adjust the distance between these two profiles in the distance that I want. So I'll start out by adjusting the distance between the two profiles here. Then I'll just fasten the L bracket against the C-beam. Now I'll move my gantry above the profile. I can now center the profile. Now I'll tighten the rest of the screws, and when doing this I have to put it upwards against the bottom side of the C-beam. So now the frame should be fully assembled and we're ready to move on. So now we're doing page 5, and here we'll install the plate onto the linear guide blocks on the Z-axis. So when doing this, just be sure that the anti-backlash nut sits inside the Z-axis C-beam. And I will insert all of the screws on the fixed side rail. So this is the fixed one and this is the loose one. Now I can tighten up all of these screws. Now I'll insert one screw in one of the blocks on the loose side. I'll just make sure that this sits roughly centered, and then I'll tighten this screw. And now this screw is defining the distance between the two rails. Now I should be able to move this back and forth and align this loose rail. So I'll do that and move it all the way to this loose end. I'll tighten up this screw. And now I'll loosen up the screw in the other side that we adjusted or tightened in the beginning. Now I can move this back and forth, and it will align two linear guides against each other. In this case I'll just insert one more screw over here. Now I can fasten the remaining screws on the linear guide blocks. Now we just need to make sure that the plate moves smoothly, and in this case it does. We are now ready to start on page 6. I'll start out by taking my ACME screw and threading it into the anti-backlash nut inside of the Z-axis assembly. So now I'll just thread it all the way through here so that it sits approximately in the middle. Now I'll take my bearings and couplers and washers here, and I'll put them onto the shaft. Now I can take my end plate, my motor plate in this case. Now I'll do the other end plate. So now, as per the drawing, I'll adjust the stick out in this end of the Z-axis. And now I'll tighten up the coupler in this end of the screw. Now we can move on to the other end. So now we'll have to preload the ACME lot a little bit to eliminate slack in the assembly. And there's two ways to do this. One way is to use your fingers, and the other way is to use this type of plier. Using your fingers is of course the most safe option, but if you're careful you can also use the pliers. And I'm going to use my pliers now. And just like in the drawing, I'm going to press against the collar and also the end of the ACME rod. And applying just a little bit of force, I'm going to tighten the collar. And now we should have a backlash-free assembly that also rotates nicely. At this point we're ready to tighten the two screws holding the anti-backlash nut. Now we can check if the assembly is backlash free. I'll try to force the plate in both directions and see if the lock collars move. I can of course make the whole assembly move, but I should try to see if the collars move while doing this. If they move you have to redo the tightening. Now we're ready to install the Z-axis assembly onto the X-axis. And we should of course keep in mind that one of these linear guides is still loose. So we'll start out by inserting all of the screws onto the linear guide blocks on the fixed rail. So in my case it's the bottom rail. And I'll just insert all of these screws loosely and then I'll tighten them. When tightening these screws, I will just lift the assembly a little bit such that it doesn't sit in the top part of the holes but rather in the bottom, so that the X-plate is lifted a little bit. Now I'll insert one screw in one of the loose linear guide blocks, and I'll just lift the linear guide a little bit. Now I should be able to move this back and forth. Now this screw is defining the distance between the two linear guides. Now we can move it all the way to one end, and then we'll start tightening the screws. After I've tightened the first screw over here, I'll loosen this screw that was adjusted in the beginning. Now we'll just tighten all of the screws, one after the other, like this. When we reach the end, I'll move the assembly to here, and then start going in this direction. Now I'll just verify that the X-axis moves smoothly. Now that we have verified that the axis moves smoothly, then we can insert the remaining screws into the linear guide blocks. So now we are doing page 8 and we'll install the lead screws on the machine. Some of the lead screws can bind a little bit when installing the bearings, so I suggest you check that the bearings fit in the ends of the lead screws. In this case this fits. But I can see that we have one bearing that binds a little bit in this end. So what I'll do is I'll take a drill and then I'll grab some sandpaper and simply hold the lead screw and wrap the sandpaper around it. Now we'll check if the bearing fits. And in this case, the bearing fits now. Now we'll start out by inserting this lead screw into the y-axis here. So I'll just push it through like this, and then I'll start threading it into the ACME nut plug. Now you should note where these screws sit in the slots. In the end, we want the screws to sit centered in the slots. When pushing this screw through, it's okay that they all sit in the right side of the slot, for example, because then when I drive this screw all the way through, now we can pull it back, and all of the screws should sit approximately centered in the slots, which is what we want. Now I'll just thread this ACME screw all the way to the end. And now I'll do the same thing for the two other lead screws. So again, here I'll start threading the ACME rod into the nut block. And I make sure that all of the screws are to the left in the slots. And that means when I push this plate a little bit, the screws will sit roughly centered. Now I'll thread the ACME screw all the way to the end. Now we'll do the same thing for the x-axis. And in this case, you can see how the screw inserted itself into the nut blocks. You can see that these screws are to the right in the slot, and these screws are to the left in the slot. And usually this will cause the bearing blocks to bind on the screws. So I'll just have to thread it backwards. And now I'll do it again. Now I can see that the screw inserted itself better into the nut blocks, because we see that the screws are approximately centered in both slots. Now that we've inserted all of the ACME rods, we're ready to put on the bearings. I'll start out by taking my flange bearings and inserting them in all of the ends of the lead screw. Now I'm ready to take my thrust bearings. So now we're ready to install our dish springs, and the dish springs look like a dish, and we insert them like this, such that they sit with the two bigger diameters against each other. So I'll take my pair here, insert it, I'll take my other pair. And these pairs should go where the tension nut sits. So now I'm ready to install my tension nuts, and they go on top of the dish springs. And when inserting this tension nut, I like to make sure that the ACME rod sits below the surface of the tension nut, because then we have a bit more threaded rod to grab onto with our coupler in the other end. And now I'll just tighten up this screw. And then I'll give it a little push like this. I'll do the same thing over here. I'll make sure the surface of the screw here is below the surface of the tension nut. Then I'll tighten the screw just a little bit and give it a push. And the same thing for the x-axis. Now we're ready to install our couplers. When inserting our couplers onto the screw, you should push with your hand in the other end, such that all of the slack is removed. Now I'm ready to tighten up this coupler. And make sure you tighten the couplers thoroughly, because if they slip on the threaded rod, it's a little tedious to readjust them. So I suggest you tighten them well. Now when rotating the screws, they will feel a little bit funny, but that's because our threaded nut blocks are moving in the slots on the plates. So now we're ready to tighten these tension nuts, and in order to do this you need to constrain the coupler in the other end from turning. And what I like to do when I'm doing it alone is to grab my screwdriver and insert it into the grub screw here and just let it rest against the table, because then this will constrain the coupler from turning. Then I'll grab my wrench here and then I'll tighten my tension nut. And when doing this, you can tighten it all the way, compressing the disc springs, but the disc springs should not be fully compressed when you tighten the tension nut. They should only be halfway compressed. So now when tightening this nut, I can see when the springs are halfway compressed. Then I'll tighten the nut. And doing it this way will get the correct tension in the screw. Now we'll just check that it moves freely. I will do the same thing for the other wires. And again, I'll tighten and compress the springs. I'll get a feel for how much force or torque it takes to compress the springs halfway. And then I'll tighten the nut. Now I'll just feel that the screw moves freely. So now, because I'm doing this alone, I'll just insert one of these aluminum spacers, and that's just to hold the coupler while I tighten the tension nut. Now I'll loosen the grub screw here. I'll tighten the nut when the springs are halfway compressed again. So now we'll adjust these ACME nut blocks in the slots, and to do this we'll have to move the axis all the way to either end, because if we do it in the middle, then the screw will sag a little bit and then you'll adjust them in the incorrect position. Now I'll move it all the way to the end here. And now I'm ready to tighten up these. Now I'll just make sure they sit roughly centered in the slots. And when tightening these, the torque that you apply to the screw will also make the block in there turn a little bit. So you should try to do it in a way where this doesn't rotate at all. So you should try to make it sit vertical in here. And you can do that by tightening them little by little. Now we'll just verify that the axis moves smoothly. And if you have backlash in your machine, you can check it by pushing it in either direction. And if you want to remove backlash, the way to do it is to loosen one end. And then you can try to retighten it, or you can try to push on it a little bit. Just a little bit, and then tighten it. This should remove all of the backlash. But when adjusting these, you may have to do it multiple times and see what result you get. So now we'll do the same thing for the two y-axes. So I'll start by moving the y-axes to one end. So now I'm ready to adjust the ACME blocks. And again, I have to make sure that they sit roughly centered. So you can see I can move the blade to either end of the slots. I'll just make sure they sit roughly in the center. And again, while tightening, I'm aware that the blocks are not tilting too much. And I'll just check for backlash. And now I'm doing the same thing in the other end. So now I'm gonna move my plate such that the screws sit approximately in the middle of the slots. And then I'm gonna tighten them carefully so the nut lock doesn't tilt, and you can also see it if the screws are not totally vertical, then the block has tilted. Now I'll just check for free movement and also if there's any backlash. We're doing page 9 now, and in order to do this page we need to tap 2 holes, one in this profile and one in this profile. So I'm gonna grab my drill with a drill compatible tap. Now I'm ready to prepare my L brackets. So I'll grab my screws and I'll just note which direction this L bracket should point in. I'm going to use the hole that is closer to the corner of the L bracket. I'm going to take my other hardware here. And then I'll install them into the holes I just tapped. Now I'll just align them so they point upwards. Now I can slide my profile onto the T-nuts. Now I'm going to install my cable chain brackets. So now I'm ready to prepare my Z-axis limit switch. I'll start by putting my 2 screws into the switch bracket. And then I'll install my limit switch onto the bracket. Now I'm ready to put my limit switch bracket onto the machine. At this point, for the Z-axis switch, I like to guide the wire like this into the side slot of the C-beam and then put a piece of slot cover on top of it. I'll just neatly guide the wire around the bracket down here. Now it's ready to go into the cable chain. I'm going to install the 2 remaining limit switches. I'll start with the X-axis. It just sits on top of the plate. I will guide the wire through the hole in the plate. I will do the same thing for the wire axis. Now we're doing page 10, and I'll just start by inserting my screws onto my motors. I'll put my coupler onto the Z-axis. Now I'm ready to put the Z-axis motor on. I'll just grab all of the aluminum spaces like this. And I'll just thread all of these screws in without tightening. Then I'll just let the motor rest in its natural position, and then I'll tighten the screws. So now we're doing page 11, and we're going to install the cable chains. And when installing these cable chains, you need to note how the end pieces here are mounted on the cable chain. And you can see it in the manual. There you can see exactly how they are supposed to be. And you can pry these open with a flathead screwdriver if you need to change how they are mounted. In my case, I forgot to put my T-nuts into the X-axis C-beam, so I'm going to use some of the spring-loaded T-nuts instead. I'll just insert them into the C-beam like this. When installing our cable chain, we need to move the axis all the way to this part of its range of motion so that we can adjust the cable chain correctly. And in my case, I can just pull on the axis. When we've moved the axis, we'll just need to make sure that the cable chain has plenty of slack in this end. So I'll adjust it somewhere like this. I'll insert my T-nuts. And again, we'll move the axis all the way to the back. Now we'll make sure that the cable chain has some slack in this end. now we've done all the wiring on the machine, and we'll just show you how we've done it. And you can of course decide yourself how you want to do it. In this case we decided that the cable chain will exit towards the front of the machine, but this can also be reversed if you wanted to exit towards the back. Now we'll show you some of the details in the wiring. So here you can see the Z-axis motor and the wire for the Z-axis switch. As you saw earlier, we guide the Z-axis switch wire through the C-beam, and then they both come up here and terminate in these plugs. And I just like to zip tie them to this spacer, and then they go into the cable chain all the way through and exit down here. And we use these cable tie holders to keep the wires neat. And they go into the cable chain, the Y-axis cable chain here, and also the X-axis switch cable goes into the cable chain here. They go through the cable chain, exit in the other end, and here all of the cables come out and go into our bundle, which will go into the black box. We also have the Y-axis switch here. I just like to give it a twist like this, such that it goes into the cable tie holder here. And here we see the far Y-axis motor. The cable just goes into the 2040 profile here, just into the middle hole of the profile. Goes all the way through, comes out here, where we have the close Y-axis motor. Both of the cables go into the 2040 profile running along and meets the rest of the cables in the other end.
Thank you, Rasmus, for taking us through the full build of this machine. I really hope that you as a builder will find it easy to put it together, and also that you will get really good use of your Piranha machine in the years to come. Thank you.